Okay, this is February 17th, 2014. I'm conducting an interview with Arnold Triplett. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
If you could tell everyone kind of your name, your age, and your location.
Sure. Arnold S. Triplett. I live in Morgantown, West Virginia, age 30.
Okay. And then what is your profession, kind of your educational background, and kind of your work?
Sure. I have a degree in communications technology and graphics technology, but my field of work right now is actually systems administration. So I deal with everyday hardware administration for server side for West Virginia University, which is a campus here in West Virginia.
Okay. And what's your do you have any other educational background?
Professionally, I did a little bit of programming originally and some engineering. That was before I switched to graphics. So,
Um, Now, would you consider yourself a gamer?
absolutely.
Okay. What type of games have you played?
Um, well, I mean, if we're talking genre, I've pretty much dipped my toe into pretty much everything. I mean, I have ones I lean toward more, such as RPGs and MMORPGs, which is role-playing game and massively multiplayer online role-playing game. In addition, I've always done the classic board games. I've done tabletops, role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons and Werewolf and Vampire the Masquerade. But as far as video games go, any genre.
Okay. So which would you say that you played more? Video games, tabletop games, board games, card games?
So for the longest time, I've played video games more than anything. Lately, I've gotten to a resurgence of trying to get back into board games and tabletop games more because I feel like there are times when I'm lacking that social interaction I really need. So lately, it's probably 70-30, 70% video games, 30% tabletop games. But for a long time, it was predominantly video games.
So when you say that you're lacking that kind of that social element that you need or are looking for, do you not get that in video games?
So, I mean, there are a lot of different types of video games, and there are definitely games that have very heavy social interaction, MMOs being one of those. Those are predominantly about playing with other people. However, I mean, even those games, I tend to play more of a single player orientation. I'm really in there to get stuff done and, to try to get the best I can get of whatever I'm doing. Whereas, you know, board games and tabletop games in general provide the the main way to interact with those is through social interaction. Um, you may give me a platform on video games to go do something. They usually almost always make it able for you to do it by yourself, or you can completely ignore that content in general if you don't need a party to do it. Whereas in tabletop, it's 99% of the time you need other people to enjoy the experience that you're going to have. So,
Okay. Um, so right now, what type of games, or what games specifically, video, tabletop, whatever, are you currently liking and are you currently playing?
so right now I'm actually playing a few different um, MMOs. Final Fantasy 14 being the predominant of those. Um, In addition, I play a lot of indie games, which are games created by independent developers. So they're not massive, big budget blockbuster games like Call of Duty or Battlefield 4, but they're more small budget, more creative games that are made by small companies. As far as board games, um, I follow a YouTube channel called Geek and Sundry. that has a show called Tabletop, and they feature a board game every other week. And usually I try to see what they're going to play, and I watch the video of them playing it. And if it seems interesting enough, I'll run out to either my local game store or to uh, a bookstore and purchase the board game and try it out with friends. Right now, I've been playing a lot of Munchkin, which is a strategic card game. I have been playing. Let's think what else I've been playing. Betrayal at House on the Hill. It's kind of a spooky haunted house game where you develop tiles and you lay them out. Um, and let's see, other big one I've been playing. Yeah, so I mean, those are the two that pop off my head right now. In addition, I currently play um, a tabletop RPG with a group of friends, usually once a month or so, and we're playing. It's called Heroes Unlimited. It's where you basically pretending to be superheroes, and I'm actually GMing or game mastering that one right now. I'm running it.
Cool. So can you speak a little bit more about culture when you were talking about the YouTube channel? Have you gone to any seminars or conventions or concerning gaming? And have you done anything else in regards to culture of gaming? Or
Sure. On a local scale, I've been to game nights at local game stores, such as the Four Horsemen, which is our local comic hobby shop here in Morgantown, to play card games such as Magic the Gathering. And on a grander scale, I've attended PAX, which is the Penny Arcade Expo, the East Edition, which is located in Boston, twice. And that's more of a grander scale where approximately 70,000 people from all over the US and the world in some cases come together to revel and share stories and be friends about video games and gaming in general, board games, card games. Basically, if it has the word game in it, um, except for the few side things such as illegal gaming, um, we tend to get together and just celebrate the fact that we all enjoy the same thing.
cool. Um, so I'm assuming you've been into all types of games since you've been young. Have you ever tried to build or develop your own game?
So I've had grand thoughts of games, and as particularly video games, I've had grand thoughts about them and concept ideas, um, and I've never really had the coding or the programming background strong enough to build such things. I'm trying to develop that now more as I have free time. But when I was younger, probably about 10 years ago or so, a group of friends and I started to develop a tabletop game together. We really weren't satisfied with the classic um, Dungeons and Dragons model that a lot of people played, and we wanted to try to do something different. So we kind of worked together and built our own rules system and things like that. And then over years, of course, people separate, and that gaming group, which was dear to my heart, has now kind of dispersed. And so now I kind of pick up the pieces where I can and try to work on that game we developed a long time ago here and there to maybe someday fleshed out into a final tabletop RPG, but that still remains unknown.
Okay, so so with video games, like you mentioned, you have to have kind of financial interest. You have to have coding expertise, and so the game that you were talking about, the one that you developed with your friends, that's a tabletop game or a board game or role
So
playing game.
tabletop, which is it's essentially pen and paper. So really, all you need is the intelligence to write down the rule systems and make things written out for people to understand, and then you give them dice and let them make the characters that they're choosing on paper. So classic pen and paper game. Um, so you're really only limited by your imagination in that context, not necessarily by your programming expertise or the hardware you have at your disposal, or licensing deals, or server maintenance, or whatever other things would come in when you're making a technical video game. Um, so it really allows for a broader spectrum of choice, which you don't always get in video games.
So your background that you said your education in communication, is that visual communication, graphic design, or text communication, or?
Yeah, so I started with well, basically, I started as a programmer, and after a year, I dropped out and enrolled under a communication and design degree because I really wanted to be the art side of it and not necessarily the programming side of it. Um, Design concept really was what was interesting. And then I finished a 2-year program in that, and then went on to get my bachelor's degree in graphics technology, or essentially graphic design.
So has that helped you in developing this game that you're kind of working on?
Um, Interesting enough, a lot of the things I've done, I did before. My love for games and board games and RPGs is a lot of what drove me toward the pursuit of my degree and not vice versa. Now, given I have also gained knowledge and understanding that I didn't have beforehand, so now I'm better able to equip and use tools and concepts and colors and you know diagramming and schematics and such. But really, it was the reverse. Whereas I loved imagination and make believe and you know creating these grand stories and these grand concepts and making these rule systems that allowed us to interact in these imaginary worlds. That led me to do actually pushed me away from the coding side, which can tend to be you know behind a screen and your mind's blank and you're just clacking away for hours on end, to be more of the visual presentation side and the things that people see at the forefront, that design usually tends to offer.
Okay. Do you think it's easier for someone to develop, let's say, a board game or a tabletop game versus a video game?
What I mean, given it's definitely always easier to develop a board game, hands down. Uh, if you think about checkers, it is one of the most essential classic board games. The rule system is not overly advanced, but people can get hours and hours of enjoyment out of that game, and all it requires is a board and two different color pieces. So, I mean, the complexity can be small or grand, and the development is, like I said before, really only limited by what you can think of. Whereas coding, not only do you have to think about it when you're making a video game, but then you have to be able to execute and develop the processes. Now, given if I'm going to develop a board game or down the road take this tabletop RPG I was talking about before that I developed with my friends and take it into a mass market, then you kind of do run into those same stumbling blocks that you could run into with coding, where I would need to find distribution, I would need to find manufacturing and that kind of thing. But as far as the actual development of the product, it's always easier to develop, I think, a board game or a tabletop pen and paper game as opposed to a video game.
Hmm. There's one of the things that I was researching is how frequently tabletop board game developers um, utilize Kickstarter, because um, the turnaround or the financial investment that they need immediately is much less, and to get a working prototype, they can do that um, relatively quickly and at a low cost. Have you considered doing anything like that with um, what's the name of the game that you're?
We really don't. I don't have like a title yet. It's kind of, Epic Crusades was the original title we played with a long time ago. Um, but I have considered crowdfunding sources such as Kickstarter. Um, that remains to be seen, due to the fact that you have to have the right audience, and you have to just putting something up on Kickstarter isn't going to guarantee you're going to get money. You also need to have the media presentation, the social integration to get word out and to get people to want to give to your product. A lot of that can be done through your own local website that has a funding scheme to it. You don't necessarily need Kickstarter, but that's definitely one of the great ways. A lot of people, and I've backed many projects. I'd say over 2 or 3 dozen projects on Kickstarter, both video game and board game alike,
Mhm.
because it's a great platform to find new and interesting thoughts in the indie space.
So do you connect? Are you involved with any other communities in the gaming communities, or any uh, groups or guilds or anything like that? Um,
So yeah, I have guilds for different games I've played over the years. I have a guild that I'm currently in where I get on once in a while, just due to work and other things that come up. But uh, we get together and play games here and there. I may see them at events occasionally. Um, Currently in Final Fantasy, I'm in a guild called Mercs with a friend at work actually, and uh, I found out that he was friends with these people online through working with him, and then in turn I have become friends with these people online. And a lot of times that's how it goes, where you have a friend of a friend, and then that group just grows bigger and bigger and bigger. So yeah, I have a few groups that I'm part of, but right now I'm not really playing anything head first. You know what I mean? I'm not into something so much so that I come home, I sit down, and I do it for hours upon hours. I kind of dabble back and forth, play whatever's coming out, check out this little indie game on the side. But I do have two or three groups that I go to pretty regularly.
so going back to what you were talking about in regards to the need for kind of socialization, and one of the reasons that what's one of the things that tabletop games provide. Um, do you necessarily think that, let's say, it sounds like that you can get more socialization from video games. Would you agree with that statement?
You can get a broader socialization from video games, not necessarily more. You can get as much socialization out of whatever game you play that you want. I could go to my local card shop or hobby store and really find a group of people I really want to play with. However, they may not be people that you're really connecting with. Your pool is limited basically when you're looking at a local search. When you're looking at a global search, I have friends that I've met online in games that are from Canada and from Europe and from Japan and China, and a few of those friendships have lasted beyond the games that we played. Some I've not spoken to since the game that we played. So like I said, the pool is bigger online, and I guess you could say there's more chance for social interaction because the community is so much larger online. It's easy to be to be an ant in that giant community and just run into another ant, as opposed to, you know, walking through Morgantown. I may walk by 100 people a day that love the same things I do, but unless we're stating something or we're wearing some kind of attire, which in a work environment you really can't, that shows your love for that thing, no one's really going to know. And even so, it might be like a passing moment of, hey, you like that, I like that. Normally a lasting bond doesn't come from those, whereas an online community that could turn into a long conversation that then develops into a friendship, because of the easeability and the accessibility.
So would you say that you've actually had more relationships or friendships build from playing tabletop or board games, or from playing online games?
I've had more lasting friendships from tabletop board games and more friendships from video games. So, like I said, I've made a ton of friends over the years from video games. Not all of them have I kept very long. Whereas I think pretty much any friend I've ever made in a tabletopping environment or in a board game environment, they've lasted much longer.
So there's actually a study that came out in 2013 that said that people who play online, if people own video games like MMORPGs or first-person shooters that are online, 60% of them played the online version, but less than 30% of that have actually played with other people.
Hmm.
And when you spoke to the fact that, well, you can do it all single player anyways, and um, why do you think that is? Why do you think that, you know, video games kind of potentially say that you connect with online players, and you can interact with people, but people don't take advantage of it as much?
So, a thing in video games that also exists in tabletop games is when you play with others in any kind of respect, they can shape your personal experience and what you're playing. So basically, a game can be really great because of the people you're playing with, or it can be absolutely awful and you never want to play that game again because of the people you're playing with. Um, they can essentially ruin your experience. The likelihood of that happening in an online environment is so much greater due to, you know, people being anonymous online. If I meet someone face to face and we play board games, there's some accountability because we have to see each other again at some point face to face. Whereas in an online space, accountability is almost zero. So, that really run into that wall of, okay, do I want to take the chance and maybe make a really great friend and play online games with them, for a long time, or can I just end up meeting a douchebag that makes me never want to play this game again, and I never want to be part of it?
Hmm. So you think that not actually being there, not having physical accountability, or being able to pick up on nonverbal cues, or just um, that it's easier for people to um, be reckless and rage quit or whatever.
Right. So, I mean, a prime example is I played an online game called Star Wars: The Old Republic, and I was very excited for this game. And I went to PAX and I saw it at the event, and had a lot of hype, as they say, for the event and for the game coming out. And I played it, and it came out, and I loved it. And the group of people I was playing with were just people I met online. I just took it. I took a plunge. I found a group of people that were playing it. I made friends with them. Leading up to the game coming out, we were kind of, great. Things were awesome. And then within only a few months of actually playing the game together, I learned that their attitudes were very different than mine on you know, what accounts for kindness or respect. And so very quickly it went downhill, and it kind of soured my experience with that game. So once I got to the point I wanted to be at, I just quit playing it. I didn't look for another group because I didn't want to take the chance of coming into the contact with that kind of same situation.
So considering that, and what is have you ever heard of the term before, like a niche tabletop game?
Well, I mean, niche can be used in any context, but yeah, in tabletop in general, it's a lot more grand because usually it's a small group of people that only has a small following that play the game and talk about the game. It's not mainstream or mass marketed. So usually, and that also exists in online games as well. Um, EverQuest One is considered a niche game nowadays because no one's really playing it, and if you're playing it, it's just because that's your thing and that's what you do. So that's a very niche crowd. Eve Online is another game that's very niche. It's a lot about economy and it's a lot about warring factions and political interference. And it's not necessarily a mainstream game that appeals to everyone. Um,
So
so,
what
but
would be an example of would you say, of a niche tabletop game?
um, well, trying to think here. The problem is with tabletop, since it's so local, a lot of it is niche to me because I don't know, really what's being played a ton on the market.
Well, let's say as in comparison to games that are now showing to decline, like Scrabble or Life or Monopoly or Trivial Pursuit.
So there are games that are specifically designed for the tabletop enthusiast, that person that's going to get together every single week with a group of friends and play tabletop games. Uh, Whereas, there are family-friendly tabletop games, such as, like you spoke of, Scrabble, Monopoly, Shoots and Ladders, uh, party games, those kind of things, where there are actually, you know, Betrayal at House on the Hill may be popular. I don't know. It's sold in stores, but that's a very niche product. Your parents aren't going to go out and just buy that because to play with their friends, like they may play, you know, solitaire or whatever other card backgammon or whatever card game they may play together. The that's more of a tabletop enthusiast game or niche.
Okay. So considering like what you were talking about, like experience, the socialization experience and the communication kind of experience that um, one can have with like tabletop games versus online video games. If you actually thought of what if you um, For younger gamers or for kids, which do you think would be more beneficial to them?
Oh, definitely board games, tabletop games. Um,
Why do you say definitely?
there's no okay, so the market in online games is almost always very, very volatile. I mean, especially in the shooter environment, which a lot of youth gravitate toward, that market is a lot of hyped violence, hyped teen angst, that then can usually rub off on other teens. Now, given a smart, intelligent teenager can understand not to engage in those things, and you can enjoy those games without having to worry about that. However, the tabletop environment, though you may get into some verbal spats with your friends, those are always going to be a more healthy, I think, environment than necessarily a online environment is going to be. Do a lot to that, uh, anonymous nature that online presents.
There's a couple of different studies that are actually in Video Game Journal magazine that actually discusses the racism in online games, the violence in online games, sexism, and even addiction. Do you think, what do you think about that? And do you think that's even possible with tabletop games?
Uh, I think it is more prevalent in on the online space, and I think the reporting about it is more prevalent in the online space. I know from experience of being part of the tabletop board game community that those things can still exist. I've known groups that, you know, are racist in some capacity due to their ignorance. Human ignorance is, prevalent everywhere. So, I mean, there's no reason why it wouldn't be accounted for. Now, the margin is much smaller, of course, in tabletop games, but also the addiction concept. I've known people who have thrown away hundreds of thousands of dollars on Magic the Gathering cards because they just have to have the next set that comes out and they're looking for cards, so they keep buying cards, buying cards, buying cards, and they throw themselves into debt beyond belief. Just like many may say that, people do on online games. Like I said, the margin for it to occur is smaller in the tabletop board game market, but the prevalent fact is it exists in both.
Okay. Um, have you ever heard of the term European or German board games or German user interface in tabletop games?
Yeah, actually, a board game I own is essentially a European design board game, Ticket to Ride. Um, these are games that are more like classical, I guess you could say, which are, they are it's a board with pieces and you're moving the pieces. There's usually not a lot of gimmicks, that kind of stuff. It is essential old school classic, Monopoly. You roll the dice, you move so many turns, and then that occurs. A lot of German games are that way as well. Strategic, long thought process, that kind of stuff. So I have heard the term. I'm not super familiar with it, but I do know they exist.
So there's have you ever heard of the concept of American like co-authored or user experience design to where some of the most popular games in Germany are like bean games or things that have tokens or pieces
Mhm.
or things that you can move around. But historically, 10 years before 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of story-driven or co-created content or the story by the players themselves. Um, have you had any experience with games like that, or?
Well, I mean, the creation of stories, by the players or the the co-op development can exist in multiple facets. Particularly, like I said, Betrayal at House on the Hill is a classic example where there really is no story until the players start to interact with each other, and that really develops what the story will become. Um, Another thing that is kind of along those veins but slightly different is the collection concept. Card games are particularly, all about that. Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, which is another concept of design where it's all about having the thing and collecting them, which then becomes a money cycle and a monetization scheme that is used. Um, but yeah, I'm familiar with games that use the co-op story development.
So if you look at these attributes that are like, let's say, video games can be addictive, tabletop games can be addictive. Um, if there's communication and cooperation and socialization in both video games and um, tabletop games, um, do you also think that there's creativity in tabletop games as well as video games?
Oh, definitely. There are games that are specifically all about creativity, both in the video game and in the tabletop environment. Um, Role-playing games, pen and paper, Dungeons and Dragons, other such tabletop RPG games are a classic example of imagination, creativity, and development. A lot of that is just what comes from your brain, what you can think of, you know. So those are situations where the entire game is creativity. Um, but there are other games that are like that in the online space and in the video game market as well, such as Minecraft is a classic example of a game that is literally a pretty blank slate and lets you just build to your heart's content. Another game that I'm actually testing right now that's in alpha development is EverQuest Next Landmark. And that entire situation is about building things and showing off what you can build and using the tools to create and have your imagination come to life in the game. So those do exist in both platforms.
So if you had to say, like, which one of the two, where tabletop games, niche tabletop games, war games on cards, tokens, whatever, versus video games really excels, what would you say then? The socialization aspect, or
Between the two, in general,
for you?
um,
Yeah.
so for
I'm not
online.
asking if one is better than the other, but where do you see the strength as tabletop?
Sure. Online games, video games in general, there's an immediacy. Uh, you can pick them up and play them at almost any time you like. Uh, you know, when we finish with this interview, I'm going to turn to my computer and play some games. Whereas when we were finished with this interview, I would have to organize weeks in advance, probably, with a group of friends to play a tabletop game, just due to scheduling conflicts and the such. Um, Whereas in the tabletop games provide a unique physical interaction with people that you just usually can't get in an online space. The camaraderie, the eating food that is seriously unhealthy for you, you know, pizza and whatnot, as opposed to, well, I mean, let's be honest, in online games, I'm usually sitting here eating unhealthy food as well. But I mean, I'm not doing it immediately with other people and sharing in that, you know, that meal, the classic, you know, old time of spending time together. Um, but online, you know, I give to the fact that I can experience it at any time. It's fleeting. I can let it go and let it come back. Um, and there's always gonna be something new for me to do. Um, Whereas, you know, tabletop, it really relies on having people that are reliable and able to get together at one location, having a physical location to be at all at once. Online game, I can be in my house, you can be at your house, you know, hundreds of other thousands of people can be at their house. Whereas, you know, if I want to play with a group of 15 people, you're gonna have to rent a hall, or know someone who just has a massive basement that has space for all of us. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So there are those issues of having that many people together in a room. But sometimes those are the greatest memories you can have is when you have those 15 people in a room that you necessarily won't always get in an online space.
Great. Well, um, thank you for your time, and thank you for being available to answer these questions. And hopefully, maybe one day we will see your game up on Kickstarter or something like that, and we can actually back it.
That will be great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate getting to talk about the thing that I love the most, games.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.